Chapter 11 covers relationships in young and middle adulthood. Um, the first consideration here is an answer to sort of an old adage that opposites attract. Social psychologists became interested in this question because it was one that was fairly broadly accepted in folklore. But what they found was interesting, and that is that opposites don't necessarily attract, nor do they make very good relationships. They found that the more similar people are, the less conflict there is, and the better the relationships tend to be. It seems that people make this selection through a process called assortative mating, which is looking for someone or seeing the process of kind of somebody seeing themselves as someone that's similar to them and along some primary dimensions. One of them is just physical attractiveness. People tend to have a self-concept or self-image about where they are on the scale of physical attractiveness, and they tend to feel more comfortable with people that seem to be somewhere on that scale. Other primary dimensions are things like culture, which is, their ethnic culture of origin, and roles of men and women in relationships, how they see that. Other factors like religious beliefs, values, goals, socioeconomic class, or perceived socioeconomic class, or just status. Those are some of the kinds of things that contribute to the sort of process that a person evaluates when they consider whether to become involved with someone. And then finally, personality variables are important here because attractiveness is shaped to some degree not just by how someone looks, but how their outward evidence of what kind of personality traits they have, how that affects someone's perception of them. So attractiveness is actually a perception, not a sensation. You may have had this experience where you see someone, and at first they look really attractive, and then they start talking and they become less and less attractive as some undesirable trait is revealed in their personality. Or the opposite can happen. Someone that's not necessarily seen right off the bat as physically attractive becomes more attractive as more is learned about that person, or you see more of their compatible personality variables. So one of the issues that is discussed in relationships is aggression or interpersonal violence in relationships. And one study that I did several years ago, the goal in my study was to develop an instrument to measure aggression in relationships along the dimension of controlling and dominating behavior, because what I was interested in is how victims of violence in relationships rate the violence. Do they rate it along physical lines, like how physically aggressive or threatening it is, or are there other factors involved? And so my theory is that with the females that I was actually doing the assessment with, which was called a fighting methods inventory, and it was a 36 item scale I gave to approximately 360 females who were residents in battered women's shelters in Dallas, Fort Worth, and in Indianapolis, Indiana, Lafayette, Indiana, and Chicago, Illinois. And so what I found was that my theory about it is that the more controlling the behavior was, that controlling and dominating factors in someone's aggression towards someone else would actually make the behavior perceived as more violent, more aggressive than actually physical violence. So I got some interesting results. Found that statements like restricting my use of the checkbook, keeping me from driving the car, or blocking me from seeing family members got rated almost as high as stab me with a knife, punch me in the face, and push and shove, things like that. So controlling and dominating behavior has been found to be an important factor in how women perceive the intensity of aggression. The beginning of the study of domestic violence actually started with Lenore Walker in the mid-'80s. She was a therapist, social worker who also studied women in battered women's shelters. And in her interviews with women, she found that they described their relationship following a certain repeatable pattern, which she described as the cycle of violence. This pattern, called the cycle of violence, involved phases. So you would have actually a aggression phase she called an explosion, where there is actually physical pushing or shoving or threatening or loud verbal behavior, followed by some denial, and apologizing, and then also in the victim some self-blame, mainly as a strategy to kind of calm things down, and then a honeymoon phase where she would be reinforced for staying in the relationship after the aggression by being treated well by him. So this it serves as an operant. It's a reinforcer that kind of maintains the relationship even when it's not a pleasant relationship. And then that's followed by a tension building phase, because all of the things that are contributing to the violent relationship are still in place. No problems have been solved. So tension builds again, you have another explosion, then you go right around the cycle again. And then the cycle over time, as you go through it, it can kind of have rises and falls, or it can gradually escalate over time. Some people have claimed that the cycle always escalates. The evidence doesn't really back that up. Some of these cycles can go on for years and never really escalate past a certain point. But the damage to the relationship, can kind of take hold over time and eventually make it impossible or difficult to stay in the relationship. Also, what I found in some victims is that to try to get control back, they would manipulate their partner by actually choosing the time when they wanted this explosion to happen and provoking it, so they could go ahead and get it going and get through it and get to the honeymoon phase. And they may actually plan that around holidays or birthdays or times when they have something important coming up. Then they would trigger the aggression so they could get past it. This also is a bigger problem in low-income families, where you've got the caregiver taking care of kids and completely financially dependent on a provider. So that's why options are to solve this problem or to escape this are much easier in egalitarian households than they are in more paternalistic or lopsided households as far as the control. So in looking at Lenore Walker's cycle of violence, and not all cases actually follow this exact cycle. There are sort of variations on how the cycle works, but disrupting the cycle is the goal, and primarily by intervening at the most dangerous part of the cycle, which is the acute phase. So actually it's intervening in phase 2. And what's important about this is that when Lenore Walker published this, when they started developing the family courts and the the laws in several states that were these programs and laws developed to try to prevent this domestic violence in households, called the Domestic Violence Protection Act, was what some of them were commonly called. What it did was it allowed the police to and the prosecutor's office to actually make an arrest without having to have a complainant. So if the police would get called to a home years before, the victim had to file a case, and so victims would either they would either make a complaint, the police would arrest the perpetrator, take him to jail, and then the victim would go down to the jail and drop the case before the perpetrator was even processed in the jail, and so they would be immediately released. What they found was whenever this cycle included an arrest and taking them to jail only to be dropped later, or the police being called to come out to the house only to be told that they did not want to press charges and the police would leave, that the violence would be much worse afterwards. So that wasn't working. So what they, as a solution, of the Violence Protection Act allowed them, the police to have discretion. So if they show up and the law says that if they have evidence that an offense has occurred, they may make an arrest. And so they could just ask, you know, did he or whoever grab the car keys out of your hand? They push you in any way or anything like that? And if they did, then they could go ahead and make an arrest and take the perpetrator off to jail. Now, what this allowed the court to do was to offer to put that person in supervision and order the perpetrator into counseling, which under recommendations could also involve marital therapy. So now in some more severe cases, it might involve a protective order issued by the county that prevents the offender from being in the home until, you know, they can be released by the court to return home, and they may have requirements on them to go to counseling and some things like that. But the whole point is that it breaks this cycle up so that you don't have this tension building, acute explosion and honeymoon phase that just maintains the cycle. So let's look at how you operationally define marital satisfaction. That's a pretty abstract term there. And how in research do they determine how they're going to define that? Well, one of the most common instruments is by Hudson, created in the early 90s, called the Index of Marital Satisfaction. And if you read studies on, you know, the success rates in marital therapy and traits of couples and the probability of success, often they'll use an instrument like the Index of Marital Satisfaction to operationalize marital satisfaction. So it's basically a questionnaire that both people in the relationship fill out without being in close proximity to each other. And it's also a really good instrument to administer to people on the first day. And when they're in marital therapy, you can administer this and get a baseline for where they are in the relationship. And then you can re-administer the Index of Marital Satisfaction as they progress through therapy and measure their progress in therapy. If you're doing research with this instrument, it's a good way to look at, you know, how they perceive their relationship is. And so it's been used. It's even been used to look at what happens to married couples if they stay married, you know, past their 30s, you know, into their midlife or late life. And interestingly enough, they found that, you know, marital satisfaction tends to naturally go down when people have kids, and then it tends to go back up after their kids get a little bit older. So you can look at longitudinal studies doing repeated measures with the Index of Marital Satisfaction. So if you look at the some of the items on the Index of Marital Satisfaction, you can see that it measures several dimensions like physical affection, caring, and does the person feel like they chose well in choosing their partner? Is there a trust in the relationship? Um, what is their prospective, their prognosis for their own relationship? Do they feel like in the future they're eventually going to dissolve the relationship? How much communication is there? How much contempt is there in the relationship? How stable is the relationship? Things like that. So these are all dimensions that they wanted to measure when Hudson created the Index of Marital Satisfaction. So you can look at dimensions of marital success. Ones we've already discussed is the degree of similarity, and that's called homogamy in a relationship. So, you know, what is their perception of the attractiveness of their partner, and their psychosocial identity, like ethnicity, social class, and like we talked about, religious beliefs and values. Those are all things that people align themselves with. If people have really radically different values, radically different beliefs about religion, radically different beliefs about politics, those are the kinds of things, even things like where they want to live and some of the practical things, like what their tastes are. Sometimes these things can be relatively minor, but sometimes they can lead to a great deal more conflict. The other sort of dimension in marital success that's important is exchange theory. This is an economic principle. And this is how much each person perceives that the other person is contributing to the relationship with regard in comparison to their own contribution. And so sociologists refer to this as the social ledger. It's kind of a Excel file in your head about, I'm putting a certain amount of energy and effort into the relationship. How much are they putting in relative to what I'm putting in? So keeping that ledger sort of relatively balanced can lead to a much more harmonious relationship. When it gets out of balance pretty dramatically, then that's when a person can start to feel like that they're not, that the relationship isn't fair. Now, some of this is just perceptual because, you know, one person may be primarily in the home and putting a lot of effort into the home, and the other person may be outside the home and putting a lot of effort, you know, in outside the home and bringing economic resources to the home, and neither one sees what the other one does all that much, and so they may have a misperception that they're putting in a great deal more effort than the other person. Also, in a kind of hyper-capitalistic environment, we've traditionally thought that the income earner, that their efforts are more important than the contribution of the person that's actually taking care of the home and stuff like that, which has put females in a disadvantage in how much their role is seen as important. So that can have a pretty significant negative impact on the relationship. Now, one really important theorist to come along in the 80s was a guy named John Gottman. And Gottman started the Gottman Institute and really investigated specifically what he thought was leading to dissolution of relationships and divorce. And he nailed it down to contempt. Like, he found that relationships that were the most fragile and had the least probability of success were ones where there was a lot of contemptuous language, like verbal abuse, put downs, name calling, and competing for who's the most valuable. And so when Gottman put together his model, he actually devised a marital therapy program that turned out to be very effective at dealing with couples in conflict, and in the relationship, he would actually focus on any language that's happening between the couple that involved kind of a sense of contempt. It wasn't just enough for them to be arguing with each other or in disagreement, but when there was contempt, there was a significant probability that the relationship would not survive. And this led to Gottman's strategy that he could use to improve relationships and to reduce the threats. Like he would get them to be more consciously aware of how they criticize each other, and to use, he's the one that came up with the idea of using I's rather than you's in conversations. Like, I believe that was a good way to start a sentence if you're trying to communicate an issue that you have. It seems to me like, or I believe that, or and as opposed to you're an idiot, or you're, you don't care, or stuff, or whatever. But you starting with you automatically prompts a defense. And the idea was to try to keep defensiveness down to a minimum. Of course, he also attacks any contemptuous language at all, like put downs, insults, making comments about people's looks, their intellect, things like that. And also just showing, some intrinsic appreciation, like dealing with somebody like you think they're important, and making just casual, positive comments, looking to phrase things in a positive way, and being able to apologize is a big deal in relationships. In fact, people who have difficulty apologizing, and I'm sure you've all known somebody that can't apologize, probably they've been punished for apologizing in the past by being humiliated, and so they don't have the confidence to apologize. But apologizing is actually pretty empowering. If a person has the ability to say, yeah, you see what I did there, I really screwed that up. If a person can get enough courage to begin to do that, it's a pretty empowering process, and they learn that's it's actually an intrinsically valuable thing to be able to do. Bailing in the middle of conflict, or throwing up distance and separation, things like that. And then also just being able to take breaks, put your head in a better environment for a little bit, especially when stresses get high, because we can easily divert our frustration onto whoever's closest, which is the spouse or kids, instead of going to a place and ventilating in some other way. And when you look at a more of an interactionist approach to what makes the vulnerability to marital stress, that is, things that make a marriage or relationships more vulnerable, it involves interacting components. One is just how resilient a person is. Interestingly enough, resilience is pretty closely tied to humor. People who are highly resilient tend to be pretty humorous. I can, in dealing with people in really difficult situations, like people that have been abused as kids, people in war zones, what you find is that the ones that seem to be able to take a lot of offense and come out okay on the other side are usually the ones that have an ability to be humorous. In fact, in really bad situations, you can kind of see gallows humor in some people. Being able to laugh at the differences between two partners, a person seeing the differences in their partner, their sort of flaws in a humorous way, that's a recipe for a much healthier relationship. Also, just how severe the threats are, and those can be how much actual stress there is, like financial stress. Right now, for example, The threat level's really high with the pandemic and the financial consequences of the pandemic, and the fact that our economic system is not really very um, good for people in the middle class and lower class and the underclass. We're just not in there's a lot of financial stress, which makes relationships harder to maintain. And that's parent-child relationships and marriages. You can also look at things like tragedies or bad circumstances and what causes that to cause destruction to a relationship. Like when a child dies, you see a real bump in the divorce rate. Also, after a bankruptcy or unemployment or some kind of other tragedy, you see increases in dissolution of relationships or divorces. And the question is why is that? And actually, there are people that intervene with families and couples when this happens. Example is after a child dies, then usually both people are grieving, and since they're grieving, the grief is an aversive stimulus, and so what happens is you can think Pavlov, and that is that the grief or the aversion from whatever the experience is gets paired with that person, because that's the person that's around you. And without realizing it, the couple can have this urge to get away from their partner because their partner is a stimulus cue for grief. And in working with parents of children with cancer, that's one of the things that gets brought up, and like it Cook's Children in the Warm Place and in family therapy intervention programs. Whenever there is, someone that's really, really sick, like a kid, and it's a real hopeless kind of situation, or a child dies, then it's real important to help the couple understand that, there's going to be a tendency to pair their grief with that presence of that other person, and it's important to have some kind of a solution for that, like having the ability to get to an environment where they're not that person's represents something other than just feeling grief or depression over the loss of the child or the tragedy or whatever it is.